Elliot Banks never expected to find himself standing at the defendant's table. Not like this. Not with cameras outside the courthouse, whispers in the gallery, and a docket that listed his name under charges that made no sense. Fraud, impersonation, obstruction. None of it true, and he knew it. But that wasn't the part that gnawed at him. What bothered him, what made this morning feel like a slow-motion mistake, was how quickly the system had turned on him. The room had barely settled when Judge Greer leaned into her microphone and muttered, "Let's get this over with." The words weren't meant for the record, but everyone heard them. No one corrected her. She didn't care. Elliot had seen her type before. Sharp tongue, impatient tone, quick to assume. But she wasn't just any judge. She was the kind who treated the bench like a throne. She scanned the room, eyes pausing on Elliot, then hardening. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," she said, this time loud enough for the court reporter to catch. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone in the back let out a small, sharp laugh before going quiet. Elliot didn't respond. Not yet. He knew this game. He'd seen the way some people in power wielded their position like a weapon, how easily they slipped into condescension when the person standing across from them looked like him. "You heard me?" Greer said again, voice tight, always looking for an easy way out, thinking you can just waltz in here and get special treatment. Elliot's attorney, who had been silent until now, leaned toward him but said nothing. There was nothing to say. The judge had already made up her mind. This wasn't a hearing. It was a performance. The prosecutor sat across the aisle, flipping through papers without urgency. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. His job was nearly done. With Greer on the bench, it wasn't even a fair fight. Elliot had known things would be tense. He'd prepared for that. But the overt disdain, the barely concealed contempt, that was new. He waited for someone to intervene, for the court clerk to object, or the prosecutor to clarify that Elliot's presence in that room had a different context, a different weight. But no one said a word. The silence became louder than any accusation. Then Elliot reached into his coat and placed something on the table, deliberately, quietly. It caught the light and drew the attention of everyone in the room. "I was hoping to be treated fairly today," he said, speaking not just to Greer, but to the entire room. "But it seems I need to remind you who I really am." Greer scoffed. She didn't even pretend to hide the smirk. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" She didn't look at the item. She didn't care. But the court did. Elliot leaned forward and slid it further into view. A badge. Clean, clear, official. Not a souvenir, not a trick. A real, federally issued badge from the Bureau. "I'm Special Agent Elliot Banks," he said, voice even. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." This time, the silence was different. Not passive, not dismissive, but sharp, active. Like something had shifted in the room and no one knew what to do next. The prosecutor stopped flipping pages. The bailiff straightened, hands uncertain. Spectators who had shown up out of curiosity now leaned in, fully engaged. "Greer?" She laughed. Not a loud laugh, but one packed with disbelief. "You expect me to believe that?" she said. "You think flashing some fake badge is going to get you out of this?" Elliot didn't move. He simply reached into his other pocket and placed a second item on the table. His ID. Official. Documented. Real. He didn't have to say anything else. But he did. "You're welcome to verify it." And just like that, the energy in the courtroom cracked. Greer hesitated. It wasn't obvious at first. Her voice stayed sharp, her posture unbothered, but the smirk had wavered. "Even if that were true," she said, "it doesn't change the fact that you're standing in my courtroom as a defendant." Elliot raised his eyes. "That's where you're mistaken, Judge." He let the words settle before continuing. "I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here on official business, and after what you just said to me, that business now includes you." No one breathed. And for the first time since the hearing began, Greer didn't have a comeback. The courtroom didn't move. A dozen people in that room, all paid to maintain order and rhythm, now found themselves spectators to a story they hadn't seen coming. Even the court reporter paused for a fraction of a second, fingers hovering. The tension wasn't theatrical anymore. It was electric. Greer leaned back in her chair, folding her arms like a parent dealing with a misbehaving child. Her tone turned brittle, sarcastic. "This is nonsense," she said. "A stunt. I don't care what kind of trick you're trying to pull, but it won't work here." Elliot didn't reply. He didn't need to. The badge gleamed on the table under the room's dull lights, and the ID beside it wasn't something you could print at a copy shop. His name, his agency, his authority, laid bare for the world to see. Still, Greer dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "You think just because you walk in with a shiny badge, you're above the law?" she said. "This is my courtroom. I run the show here." He let that hang. He had already offered her the chance to recalibrate, to walk it back, to consider the possibility that she might have jumped to conclusions. Instead, she doubled down. Elliot turned his head slightly and addressed the bailiff, who had gone still as a statue. "I suggest you verify my credentials," he said. "Call the bureau. You'll find my authority outranks hers." The bailiff didn't move at first. No one ever tells the bailiff what to do. But this wasn't a usual day, and the document sitting on the table wasn't a prop. The hesitation wasn't defiance. It was confusion. Protocols weren't designed for situations like this. Greer's eyes flicked to the bailiff, then back to Elliot. "You don't get to dictate how things go," she snapped. "I've had enough of this circus. We're moving on." She grabbed the next case file. Theatrics over. Or so she thought. Elliot stayed in place. "Actually, Judge," he said, stepping forward. "You're the one who's done." The room reacted as if he'd thrown something across it. The words hit hard, too sharp and too clear to ignore. Even the prosecutor, who had been perfectly content to ride the wave of the judge's authority, looked up, eyes darting between them. Greer froze. "Excuse me?" she asked, low and controlled. Elliot didn't flinch. He reached into his inside pocket, slower this time, and removed a folded envelope, thick, sealed with an official stamp, the kind you don't open lightly. He unfolded the document with the care of someone revealing something final. "This is a federal warrant," he said, "signed, sealed, and delivered for your arrest." That was it. That was the turn. Everything else dissolved. The crowd, the court officers, the glares, the power plays, all of it went quiet. The prosecutor dropped the pen he'd been holding. The bailiff took a step forward, as if his body moved before his mind had caught up. One of the spectators gasped, a real human sound in a room that had been playing pretend until now. Greer laughed again, but this time it lacked its earlier bite. "This is a joke," she said. "You can't be serious." Elliot didn't respond. The bailiff approached, slowly now, reaching for the document. He held it up, scanning each line, taking in the signature, the department seal, the language. His eyes narrowed. Greer's expression began to shift, inch by inch. She was watching someone else hold her fate. And not just someone she'd tried to humiliate 10 minutes ago. The bailiff looked up. He didn't speak right away. The pause was longer than it should have been. Greer's voice cracked through it. "You think you can walk into my courtroom and pull this kind of stunt?" she asked. "I'm a judge. Do you understand what that means? I decide who gets arrested in this room." Elliot remained silent. The badge and warrant did all the talking. He finally turned slightly, nodding toward the bailiff again. "She's stalling," he said. "You've read the warrant. You know what needs to be done." The bailiff hesitated. He glanced at Greer. She didn't meet his eyes. A beat passed, then another. Finally, the bailiff stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I need you to stand up." Gasps returned, this time louder, no longer polite courtroom murmurs. This wasn't a trial anymore. This was history. Greer barked a laugh that landed wrong in the silence. "You have no idea who I am," she said. "You really think you're going to walk out of here with this farce?" Elliot didn't raise his voice. "Not anymore," he said, and that was when the courtroom broke. Not physically, but spiritually, structurally. The hierarchy cracked. Greer's voice came again, desperate now. "I've sat on this bench for 23 years. I've ruled over more cases than you've read reports. This isn't how this works." The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, watching it all unravel like he had front-row tickets to the collapse of an empire. Elliot stayed where he was. "This isn't happening," Greer muttered. And still, no one moved to stop it. Not the clerks, not the guards by the door, not the court reporter who kept typing, her eyes wide. The bailiff was still waiting. Greer finally looked at Elliot, something different in her eyes. But if she was searching for sympathy, she was in the wrong room. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The moment stretched. People held their breath without realizing. In every corner of that room, the same thought floated, unspoken but loud. What happens now? The bailiff didn't flinch. He didn't need backup. He didn't need permission. The warrant had already spoken louder than any voice could. Still, he waited, one final pause, for the judge to move voluntarily. Nothing happened. Greer remained frozen behind the bench, gripping it like it could shield her from what was already happening. "Judge Greer," the bailiff said, firmer now. "Please, don't make this harder than it has to be." She shook her head. "This is a mistake. I've done nothing wrong." Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from disbelief. "You people don't get it. This won't stick. I'll be back here next week, same bench, same robe, and every one of you will be right where I left you." The courtroom didn't agree. No one nodded. No one stood up in protest. Even the people who had worked with her for years were quiet, their eyes fixed on the ground or the ceiling, anywhere but her. Elliot stepped back and let the room take in the moment. This wasn't about theatrics. This was about accountability, and no one needed to perform anymore. The document on the table, the silence around them, the eyes watching, it all made the moment real enough. "You think you've won," Greer said, not even looking at him now. "But this is just temporary. One hearing, one headline, and then it all resets. You don't know how this system works." Elliot remained silent. She wasn't wrong about how things usually went. But today wasn't usual. The bailiff moved forward, reaching slowly. It was an odd thing to see. Someone approaching a judge not to speak, not to hand over papers, but to do the one thing judges never expect: make an arrest. Greer didn't fight. She didn't protest again. She just stood there as the process unfolded around her, the air charged with a kind of disbelief no one could fully process. The sound of procedure replaced the sound of power. The cuffs clicked. Not loud, but loud enough. Someone in the audience let out a gasp. Not everyone clapped. This wasn't that kind of scene. The applause would come later, outside. For now, it was just shock. Greer turned slightly toward Elliot, eyes narrowing. "You think this makes you a hero? You think you've saved the system? You've embarrassed an institution. You've crossed a line." Elliot didn't move. "Your corruption ends today," he said. And that was it. No speech, no dramatic exit line, just the truth, plain and irreversible. The bailiff led her down the small steps behind the bench. Her robe dragged slightly as she walked. For years, that robe had been her shield, her signature, her command. Today, it was just fabric. The clerk resumed typing. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, then stood up. He cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances," he said, loud enough for the record, "the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges against Special Agent Banks immediately." No one objected. A second judge, someone no one had noticed until now, stepped up and took the vacant seat. There was no fanfare, no formality, just someone doing their job. They looked at the room, then at the prosecutor. A single gavel strike followed. Case dismissed. That was the sound that broke the tension. And then, for the first time all morning, people moved. Real movement. Heads turned, whispers returned, energy poured back in like a flood. The bailiff handed over the signed paperwork. The clerk marked it done, and Elliot picked up his badge, tucking it back into his pocket. He walked out without a word, past the reporters who had started lining up outside, past the onlookers who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. He didn't stop for comments, didn't wave, didn't break stride. The truth had done what it was supposed to do. Inside, people lingered, not because they had to, but because they weren't ready to leave just yet. They had come to see a hearing. What they got was a reckoning. One woman turned to her friend and whispered, "He really was FBI?" "Yeah," the friend replied, "and she really was dirty." Out in the hallway, the sound of a dozen phones buzzed, journalists scrambling to rewrite their narratives. Headlines were already forming. Judge arrested in her own courtroom. FBI agent clears his name and exposes corruption. Justice reversed. Elliot didn't need to see them. He didn't do this for headlines. He didn't do it to make history. He did it because somewhere along the way, the people who were supposed to uphold the law had started to believe they were the law. And that was something he could never let stand. Not today. Not ever. The doors closed behind him, but the weight of what had just happened didn't. Elliot didn't rush. The corridor ahead was quiet, sterile, but his phone began vibrating almost immediately. Messages, calls, alerts. Some from his team, others from people he hadn't heard from in years. He ignored them all. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere hadn't settled. The substitute judge remained in the seat like it was a live wire, unsure how long they were expected to hold it. Clerks began stacking paperwork, talking in low tones, unsure if anything else on the day's docket still mattered. The morning's schedule had been blown to pieces by the one thing nobody expected: accountability. But Elliot's day wasn't over. He made it to the curb before a familiar voice called out from the corner. Agent Banks. He turned. Assistant U.S. Attorney Dana Holloway stood beside a black SUV, her coat slung over one arm, a folder in the other. She looked like someone who had already read the morning summary 3 times and was ready for the next headline. "You just reset half the federal judiciary's blood pressure," she said, handing him the folder. "I didn't write the warrant," Elliot replied. "No, you just dropped it at her feet like a mic." Elliot opened the folder. Inside were copies of communications, sealed reports, and one crucial item: a complaint filed by a whistleblower from inside Greer's own chambers. It had taken almost a year to build the case. Financial misreporting, bribes buried in routine decisions, backroom deals with defense attorneys. Greer had spent years perfecting the illusion of impartiality while selling verdicts to the highest bidder. "We'll need to prep for the follow-up," Dana said. "Press is going to want more, and the Bureau's not thrilled that we didn't give them a heads up about today's timing." Elliot didn't look up. If they were in the loop, it would have leaked. "Still, this makes you the story." "I'm not the story. She is." Dana didn't argue. She knew he hated attention, hated the glare that came with moments like this. But what he had done wasn't just about exposing one corrupt judge. It was about reminding the system that no one was untouchable, not even the ones behind the bench. Back inside the courthouse, the murmur of disbelief lingered like smoke. The court staff whispered about resignation letters. Junior clerks texted each other under desks. One bailiff stood quietly at the back of the room, replaying the events in his head like he still wasn't sure they were real. And somewhere in the courthouse basement, Judge Evelyn Greer sat in holding, her robe folded neatly beside her, her wrists still marked from the cuffs. She had made one call to her attorney. No one else, no friends, no colleagues, no one who would return her call today. She had asked if she could keep her bench once the matter was resolved. The answer hadn't come. An hour passed, then 2. By late afternoon, the federal marshals had arrived with transport orders, and Greer was moved, quietly, efficiently. There were no cameras this time, no reporters shouting questions, just a hallway and the slow grind of due process catching up. At the same time, Elliot was back in the field office 2 blocks away, going through the report drafts. Each one more detailed than the last, every allegation now validated, every lead now corroborated. Greer's influence stretched wider than expected. Dozens of cases flagged, sentences questioned, plea deals reopened. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a shockwave. Supervisors from D.C. called in. So did a senator. Elliot deflected them all. He wasn't interested in TV appearances or interviews. Let someone else take the spotlight. His job was to investigate, not to bask. But the Bureau had already sent comms to every field office, internal bulletins, praise. A message from the deputy director calling it a defining moment for institutional integrity. That phrase stuck with him. Institutional integrity. It sounded clean, almost sterile, like it could be printed on a poster and pinned to a break room wall. But today hadn't been clean. It had been messy, uncomfortable, tense. It had been filled with risk. Greer could have buried him. If the warrant hadn't been airtight, if the Bureau hadn't backed him up, if even one piece of evidence had wobbled, she would have crushed his credibility and walked out untouched. But she hadn't, because she underestimated one thing. Elliot wasn't afraid of her title. He wasn't afraid of her courtroom. He wasn't afraid of the optics. He was afraid of what happened when people like her were allowed to continue unchecked. By evening, the courthouse was empty again. Just janitors mopping scuff marks from the floor and a few reporters still waiting outside, hoping for a quote that would never come. The city carried on, barely aware that something monumental had taken place within one of its quiet stone buildings. Elliot left through the back. No cameras, no applause. He stopped at a corner diner on the way home, ordered coffee, and sat in a booth facing the window. No badge, no briefcase. Just a man, off the clock, staring out at a world that still had a long way to go. But tonight, at least, it had taken a step in the right direction. 3 days after the arrest, the courthouse reopened its heavy front doors under a different kind of silence. Not the usual morning rustle of attorneys exchanging banter or clerks calling out calendar items, but something colder, like a collective pause had settled into the walls. Judge Evelyn Greer's name had already been scraped off the official directory. Her courtroom was reassigned, her office sealed. Her desk, once cluttered with handwritten notes and pre-signed orders, was now evidence. The administrative staff she'd handpicked over the years were all placed on temporary leave. An internal audit had been launched. Every ruling, every file, every decision she'd made in the last 7 years under review. Elliot watched from the third floor as a box of documents was carried out by 2 marshals. Case logs, sealed transcripts, depositions with inexplicable redactions. Files that had once slipped through the cracks were finally seeing daylight. By noon, Dana Holloway arrived with 2 paralegals and a rolling briefcase full of sealed motions. She didn't stop for small talk. They had to prepare for the inevitable wave: appeals, retrials, ethics hearings. Every defendant who had ever stood before Greer now had legal grounds to demand a second look. Inside a meeting room converted into a command hub, Dana laid out the map of the damage. It was worse than they thought. 42 cases showing signs of manipulation, she said, pointing to a chart pinned with names, charges, and sentencing discrepancies. At least 12 involved attorneys who were flagged in unrelated investigations. Elliot stood across the table, arms folded, scanning the list. "And the prosecutors?" he asked. "Some complicit, some clueless. What about the defense attorneys? A few got sweetheart deals, others were threatened into silence." Knox entered the room mid-briefing, holding a fresh report. "Greer's arraignment got postponed," he said. "Her legal team's stalling with a motion to dismiss based on procedural mishandling." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "They're already playing that card?" "Hard," Knox said. "Claiming your badge wasn't visible during the arrest, trying to spin it like it was personal retaliation." Dana shook her head. "They're throwing darts, hoping one sticks." "She still thinks this is salvageable," Elliot said. "She doesn't understand that we didn't come after her. We pulled the curtain back. The rot was already there." The rest of the team nodded, but no one looked relieved. They knew this wasn't the end. It was just the start of a longer grind. Years of fallout, reviews, restitution. Justice didn't move fast, even when it finally moved. That evening, Elliot drove back through the neighborhoods that surrounded the city's Southern Court District. Strip malls, fast food chains, old brick apartment buildings. The places where most of Greer's defendants came from. Places where plea deals weren't negotiated. They were forced. Where overworked public defenders stand a chance against the gravity of a courtroom already tilted. At a corner gas station, he parked and sat for a moment, engine running. His phone buzzed with an alert from the Bureau's secure system. Greer's attorney had issued a press statement. "My client maintains her innocence and asserts this arrest was politically motivated, orchestrated by individuals with personal vendettas and a disregard for judicial independence." He read it twice. Then he deleted it. By the time he got home, the news channels had already aired portions of the statement. Panelists debated whether the arrest set a dangerous precedent. A former judge said it threatened the sanctity of the robe. Another commentator called it long overdue accountability. Viewers were split, like they always were. The truth didn't care. The next morning, Elliot returned to the Bureau's office to find a message waiting for him. A young woman named Clarissa Moreno had requested a meeting. She'd been sentenced by Judge Greer 2 years ago, claimed her court-appointed attorney never filed an appeal. She said she had documentation that proved her case had been mishandled from the start. They met in the interview room just after noon. Clarissa sat with a manila folder clutched in her hands. She wasn't nervous. She was angry. Calm, but angry. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for answers. "My record isn't clean," she said, "but I was railroaded." Elliot opened the folder, skimmed the contents. The dates didn't match the court file. Signatures were missing from official pages. A crucial motion appeared to have been filed late, but Clarissa had a time-stamped copy from weeks earlier. He looked up. "You kept all this?" "I knew something was wrong. I wasn't going to let them gaslight me." He nodded slowly. "We'll look into it." Clarissa didn't thank him. She just stood, gathered her things, and walked out. It wasn't gratitude she came for. It was validation. After she left, Elliot scanned her documents into the system. Another ripple. Another case, another reminder. Greer's downfall wasn't just about punishing corruption. It was about unearthing the lives buried beneath it. He closed the file and added it to a new folder, Greer Post-Arrest Review. Then he paused and renamed it Recovery. Because that's what this was now, not just retribution, but repair. Not just taking down a judge, but lifting up the voices that had been silenced under her rule. It was going to take time, but Elliot had plenty. A week passed. The headlines shifted. Greer's arrest had cycled out of the primetime loop, replaced by newer, flashier scandals. But inside the Bureau and across the Judicial Review Board, the real work had just begun. Elliot spent most of his days locked in interviews. Defendants, former clerks, court officers, even a retired janitor who remembered shredding bins getting heavier around Greer's courtroom during certain weeks. Everyone had a piece of the puzzle, and none of those pieces pointed to innocence. By Thursday morning, the review team had logged 78 suspect rulings. 12 had already led to motions for reversal. A few sentences were commuted. One man who'd served 5 years for a plea deal struck under suspicious conditions was released pending retrial. The system had started to breathe again. But not everyone was happy. Some in the judiciary saw Elliott's investigation as a breach of sacred ground. Judges, they argued, needed insulation from political and procedural pressure. The argument wasn't new. It had been used before to protect power from oversight. This time, though, it wasn't holding. The Bureau doubled down, issuing a rare public statement. It praised the bravery of agents who seek truth, even when that truth lives within the walls of power. Elliott's name wasn't mentioned, but he didn't need it to be. Still, the backlash trickled in. Anonymous messages, online chatter, quiet looks in federal hallways. Internal politics worked in whispers, and Elliott could hear them clearly. The way some agents stepped around him, the way a few former colleagues avoided his calls, he understood the cost. He'd counted on it. Then came the subpoena. Late Friday, a courier delivered it to Elliott's desk. A civil suit filed on behalf of Judge Evelyn Greer, naming him directly. Claims of reputational damage, unlawful arrest, and abuse of authority. It was loud, theatrical, and meant for headlines. He read it once, calmly. The language was predictable. The signature at the bottom belonged to a high-profile defense attorney known more for press conferences than actual wins. Knox walked in minutes later. "You see it?" he asked. "I saw it. They're trying to scare you off. I'm not moving." "You're going to need representation," Elliott nodded. "Already called someone." Knox sat down, sighing. "This isn't just about her anymore. The more you uncover, the more this becomes a referendum. On them, on us. They're scared we'll find more. And we probably will." That night, Elliott drove to a small law office just outside the city to meet his attorney, a former federal prosecutor turned private counsel. They spoke for an hour. She wasn't concerned. The warrant had been clean, the process tight, the documentation impeccable. But she warned him anyway. "They're going to dig," she said, "into everything, every memo, every report, every decision you've made in the last 10 years. I've got nothing to hide. Good. That'll make you dangerous." By Sunday, Greer's legal team went public again. Morning shows, press briefings, a televised interview in which she called the Bureau's actions a betrayal of the Constitution. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the evidence. She made it personal. This was a vendetta, she said, not justice. Elliott watched the clip once, then turned it off. Her words didn't bother him. What bothered him were the people who believed them. But the real blow came Monday morning. A memo leaked, internal court correspondence from 3 years earlier. It referenced a private complaint about Greer filed by an unnamed source. The complaint had been buried, no action taken, no record entered. Now it was out. The timing wasn't random. The clerk who leaked it sent an unsigned note to the Bureau. "She's been protected for years. Thought you should know." Elliott added it to the report. The more they dug, the more the myth collapsed. Greer wasn't just corrupt, she was protected, enabled, guarded by silence, by status, by fear. And still, the pushback grew. An op-ed ran in a major paper accusing the Bureau of weaponizing accountability and setting dangerous expectations for judicial conduct. One senior judge anonymously warned that if this becomes the standard, no one will want the bench. Dana Holloway sent it to Elliott with a one-word subject line, "Good." They didn't want the bench? Then maybe it was never theirs to sit on. By midweek, the disciplinary committee had filed a formal motion to permanently revoke Greer's license to practice law. Her attorneys scrambled to delay the hearing. Their last argument was as hollow as the rest. She was being punished for making tough decisions. Elliot sat in the review room when the notice came in. A clerk read it aloud flatly. She's been disbarred. No cheer, no applause, just relief. A quiet acknowledgement that one chapter had closed. But Elliot knew better. This wasn't the end of the book. It was just the first page that got rewritten. 2 months later, the cases started falling like dominoes. Not all at once, not with dramatic flair, but with the quiet efficiency of justice finding its way back into rooms it had once been locked out of. Defendants whose voices had been smothered were finally heard. Some got new trials. Others saw their sentences vacated. One man, wrongfully convicted of assault after evidence had been suppressed under Greer's oversight, walked out of prison into the arms of a daughter he hadn't seen since she was 4. The media moved on, as expected. New controversies, new villains. The spectacle of Greer's downfall no longer filled airwaves, replaced by louder, messier headlines. But for those still picking through the wreckage she left behind, the story was far from over. Elliot knew that better than anyone. He was still at the bureau, still working the Greer review team, still receiving letters from people who had once given up on the idea of fairness. Some letters were long, typed, full of legal citations. Others were short, one sentence, hand-scrawled, often shaky. "Thank you for not forgetting us." He saved those in a folder, kept them at his desk, not to feel heroic, but to remember what this fight had really been about. On a cold Thursday morning, Elliot stood in a packed community auditorium, invited to speak at a legal integrity summit. He hadn't planned on accepting the invitation, but Dana had pushed. "They need to hear from someone who didn't blink," she told him. So he stood at the podium, suit clean, tie slightly askew. No slides, no rehearsed speech. Just a quiet room filled with young attorneys, law students, and a handful of judges trying to rebuild trust in the wake of the scandal. "I'm not here to talk about Evelyn Greer," Elliot began. "You already know her story. You've seen the footage, read the filings, watch the fallout. That's not why I'm standing here." He paused. "Let them listen. I'm here to talk about silence, not the kind in a courtroom when the verdict drops, but the kind that creeps in when something is wrong and nobody wants to say it out loud. The kind that lets corruption thrive because challenging it feels like risking everything." Heads nodded, slowly. "I've worked long enough in this system to know that silence isn't neutral. It's complicit. Every time someone looked the other way while Greer bent the law, the silence got louder. Every time someone said, 'That's just how things work,' the silence took root." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. But justice doesn't die from loud acts. It dies from quiet surrender, from people who know better choosing not to act, from 1,000 small decisions to stay comfortable instead of being courageous. The room was still. "So if you're here because you want to change things," he said, "you're in the right place. But don't expect applause. Don't expect backup. Expect resistance. Expect isolation. And when it comes, remember, truth doesn't need a spotlight to be real. It just needs someone to stand beside it." He stepped down to a quiet ripple of applause. Not loud, not forced, just honest. Later that night, Elliot walked home alone, coat buttoned, coffee in hand. The city looked the same. Crowded sidewalks, sirens in the distance, a newsstand already cycling through tomorrow's drama. But he felt different. He passed by the old courthouse, Greer's old courthouse, and saw that the bronze plaque with her name had been replaced. Not erased. Replaced. Below the new judge's name was a line etched into the metal. "Justice is earned, not assumed." He didn't stop walking. Back in his apartment, Elliot turned on a small desk lamp and sat at his kitchen table. The folder of letters sat nearby. He reached for one he hadn't opened yet. No return address, no name. Inside, just a single sheet of paper with 5 words. "You gave us back hope." He stared at it for a long time. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, something had changed. Not because one judge fell, but because someone stood up. Because someone said enough. And because justice, real justice, isn't about who wears the robe or who holds the gavel. It's about the people willing to speak when it's easier to stay silent. The kind of people who know that the hardest part of truth isn't finding it. It's refusing to look away when you do. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. We're truly grateful for your attention and support. Stories like this aren't just about dramatic moments or legal twists, they're about real values. Standing up for what's right, challenging silence, and believing that truth still matters in a world full of noise. We hope today's journey reminded you that courage often begins in quiet ways, and that justice doesn't always wear a robe. It lives in our choices. If you'd like to support our channel, it's simple. Just hit the like button. It helps us more than you know. We'd also love to hear from you. Leave a comment below to tell us which country you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Your thoughts matter, and your voice helps build a global community around these powerful human stories. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories to come. Stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us who we are when no one's watching. Thanks again for being here. We'll see you in the next one.